Imagine a night so cold, so merciless, that the world feels like it's holding its breath. The kind of night where every step outside feels like stepping into a frozen storm, where the wind doesn't just bite, it cuts straight through to your bones. And in the middle of this blizzard, a tiny house stands alone. Inside, an elderly black grandmother, her hands shaking, her breath shallow, her heart racing, is staring out into the white nothingness, wondering if anyone will come for her. She is not just cold, she is completely alone. Now picture this, a group of men known for toughness, for riding with roaring motorcycles, and a reputation that makes headlines. Men most people would cross the street to avoid, hear about her struggle. And instead of ignoring it, they make a choice. A choice that shocks everyone who would ever expect them to act this way. By the time night falls fully, the storm howls louder, snow piles higher, and the clock ticks relentlessly. Every second feels like a lifetime for her. But somewhere beyond the frozen streets, the Hell's Angels are on their way. Not for themselves, not for glory, but for her. And what happens next changes everything. Before we dive into the incredible story of that night, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any more uplifting stories like this one, because stories like these remind us of the power of humanity, and you'll want to see every moment. The wind screamed like a living thing, clawing at rooftops and rattling window panes. Snow whipped across the empty streets, painting everything in a blinding white, erasing familiar landmarks. Every step outside was a gamble, every second a risk. And yet, somewhere beyond the edge of town, engines roared. Not ordinary engines, thunderous, relentless, demanding attention. A pack of motorcycles cut through the darkness, headlights slicing through the storm like blades. Each rider was a story in themselves. Tattoos telling tales of chaos and loyalty, leather jackets marked with scars of past battles. People might see fear in them. People might expect selfishness. But tonight, there was no room for expectation. At the front, a man named Marcus led the pack. He was a force of nature, eyes sharp as ice, heart stubborn as steel. He didn't speak much, but his silence carried a weight that made the others follow without question. They didn't know why they were risking frostbite, why they were defying every instinct to protect themselves, but they felt it, the pull of something bigger than themselves. Miles away, in the small house buried under snow, the elderly grandmother's hands clutched the threadbare blanket tighter. Every shadow felt like it could hide danger. Every creak of the house made her heart skip a beat. She had lived long enough to expect the worst from people. She had forgotten how it felt to hope. But hope was coming for her, on 4 roaring wheels, slicing through the storm. The storm wasn't just an obstacle, it was a test. Snow slowed them, ice threatened to throw them from their bikes.
Wind tried to push them back, but with every challenge, their resolve hardened. They were racing against the storm and against time itself. And in a story like this, every second counts. Every heartbeat matters. If this story is gripping you, hit that subscribe button. The night is far from over, and what comes next will defy everything you think you know about courage, loyalty, and humanity.
The storm was no longer just a storm. It was a living wall of white, a furious, swirling monster that seemed determined to stop anyone who dared cross its path. Visibility dropped to mere feet, Each second felt like eternity. Inside the tiny house, the grandmother's breaths came in shallow gasps. She pressed her hands against the frost-covered window, straining to see through the blizzard. Her mind raced, imagining every worst-case scenario. The world had taught her that help often didn't come, that people turned away, that nights like this were meant to be endured alone. And yet, she felt it. A faint vibration in the distance, like the heartbeat of some colossal creature approaching. Then came the sound, low, persistent, unrelenting, the roar of engines through the snow. Outside, Marcus and the riders fought against the storm with every ounce of skill and willpower. Tires slid on ice, snow tore at their faces, muscles burned from constant tension, and still they pushed forward. For her. Not for fame, not for recognition. For a stranger whose life mattered because sometimes the right choice isn't easy, it's necessary. They emerged from the fog like ghosts, black silhouettes against the endless white, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Even the storm's fury held its breath. Inside, the grandmother saw the lights first, blinding, hopeful, impossible. Tears streaked her frostbitten cheeks. She whispered a name she hadn't spoken in years, a name that carried all the weight of fear, despair, and the desperate hope that someone, anyone would come. And then, just as the snow threatened to swallow everything, the riders reached her door. Marcus dismounted, his leather boots crunching in the snow, and extended a hand. Not a hand of judgment, not a hand of hesitation, but a hand that said, "You are not alone." The storm raged. The world outside was unforgiving, but in that moment, in that small, frozen house, something undeniable happened. Humanity, raw, unyielding, unexpected, broke through the ice. Moments like this remind us why we tell stories, and if you're feeling the weight of this night, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest. The storm is far from over, and the choices these men make next will change everything. The door creaked open, and a gust of wind threw itself inside, freezing every exposed inch of skin. The grandmother shrank back instinctively, but Marcus's steady voice cut through the chaos. "It's okay, we've got you." Simple words, but in a night like this, in a world that had long since forgotten kindness, those words were a lifeline. The storm outside was relentless. Snow whipped sideways, ice threatened to crack underfoot, and the world beyond the house had become a white void. Every second felt like a battle, every step a negotiation with death itself. The riders formed a human shield, flanking her as she struggled to wrap herself in blankets and coats Marcus handed her. Their presence was intimidating to anyone who didn't know the truth. These were men who could have chosen anything else, but tonight they chose her. As they stepped into the blizzard, the night tried to swallow them whole. One rider slipped, boots skidding on ice, but a quick hand shot out, steadying him before disaster struck. The grandmother clutched Marcus's arm, feeling the strength of a stranger anchoring her against the storm. Time slowed. The wind roared. Every step forward was a small victory, a defiance of the world's cruelty. And yet, even with the roar of engines and shouts of coordination, fear lingered like a shadow. At one point, the grandmother stumbled, her legs trembling like fragile reeds, but Marcus caught her mid-fall. "You're stronger than you think," he said. And somehow, despite everything, the cold, the snow, the fear, she believed him. The riders pushed through drifts taller than their bikes, engines straining, hearts pounding, muscles screaming. Every turn of the wheel was a testament to determination. Every shouted instruction was a vow that no one would be left behind. And then, in the distance, a faint glow. Shelter, warmth, safety. A place where the storm's claws couldn't reach. The night wasn't over. Not by far. But for the first time in hours, the grandmother allowed herself to imagine a future beyond fear. If your heart is racing right now, hit subscribe. The next chapter shows how courage meets compassion in the most unexpected way, and trust me, you won't want to miss a second. The glow of safety grew brighter, but the storm was relentless. Snow slapped faces, and ice threatened to knock them off their feet. Every step forward felt like defiance against the world that had tried to bury them alive. The grandmother's hands were raw and shaking, but she held on. Every breath was a battle, every heartbeat a reminder that survival sometimes depended on others' bravery. And these men the world had written off as reckless, dangerous, selfish, were rewriting that narrative with every stride. Marcus glanced at her. Almost there, just a little further. It wasn't just direction. It was reassurance, words that carried weight, warmth, and hope. And in a night like this, hope became as vital as air. Behind them, the riders formed a protective circle, their engines now a low, continuous growl that seemed to push the storm back. Ice and snow threatened to topple them, but they didn't flinch.
Each one had made a choice. They would not fail. For the grandmother, the world had always felt like a place that could turn its back at any moment. But tonight, it was different. She saw hands roughened by years, faces hardened by life, and hearts wide enough to hold someone they didn't know. They reached the edge of the safe haven, a small cabin lit by firelight. The warmth inside hit her like a wave, but more than that, it was the presence of human kindness. She stepped inside, still trembling, but with tears streaming down her face. One rider, barely audible over the storm, muttered, "See, not so bad." And in that simple statement, she felt the impossible. Gratitude, relief, and awe at the courage of strangers who became heroes without fanfare. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, humanity had already won. If this story is gripping you, remember, moments like these are what remind us of the extraordinary courage in ordinary people. Hit subscribe now, because the next chapter reveals how a night like this can change lives forever. Morning came slowly, like a cautious visitor. The storm had passed, leaving streets buried in white, and a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The kind of silence that makes you notice your own heartbeat, your own breath, the weight of everything that had just happened. Inside the small cabin, the grandmother wrapped herself in a warm blanket, still trembling, but alive. The fire crackled, a small, defiant warmth in a world that had tried to freeze her completely.
She looked at the riders, men who could have been headlines for chaos and lawlessness, and saw something she hadn't expected: unwavering compassion. Marcus sat across from her, sipping a mug of coffee, his face calm but alert. Around him, the others were quiet, cleaning snow from their jackets, tending to scraped hands and sharing silent glances that spoke volumes. They didn't boast. They didn't need to. Their actions had already told the story. The grandmother's voice broke the quiet. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Marcus said. "Just live. That's enough." It was simple, but in those words was a world of meaning. The kind of meaning you can't put in headlines or trophies, only in moments where humanity shines brightest, when courage meets necessity, and when the unexpected heroes show up. Outside, the world was beginning to stir. Snow glistened under the rising sun. Footprints marked the paths they had taken, evidence of lives intersecting in ways that mattered more than anyone could have anticipated. And for the grandmother, a lesson unfolded she hadn't expected.
People, even those you fear or misunderstand, can surprise you. They can restore your faith when hope feels lost. They can remind you that heroism isn't always about glory. It's about choosing to do the right thing, even when it's hard. If this story is moving you, hit subscribe. The next chapters dive deeper into the bond formed that night and how one act of courage can ripple far beyond what anyone imagines. Days had passed, yet the memory of that night lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The grandmother moved through her home differently now, slower, with a newfound reverence for life, noticing details she had long ignored. The warm light spilling through her windows, the smell of coffee brewing, the laughter of neighbors outside.
But it wasn't just her life that had changed. The riders carried the night with them too, a quiet weight in their chests that reminded them courage had meaning beyond adrenaline and reputation. Marcus, normally stoic, found himself replaying her fragile smile, her trembling hands, the relief in her eyes when he reached out. It was a reminder of something simple, yet profound. Strength was not only in fighting battles you expect. It was in showing up for the ones that mattered most, when no one was watching. The neighborhood began to murmur about the storm, about the men who had appeared out of nowhere to protect an elderly woman. Rumors mixed with awe, fear, and gratitude. People were reminded that heroism didn't always wear a cape. It sometimes came on roaring engines, leather jackets, and a willingness to stand against the impossible. The grandmother, too, began to act. Small gestures at first, checking on neighbors, sharing what little food she had, speaking words of encouragement to strangers who looked like they'd given up hope. The storm had shown her that connection was possible, and she intended to pass it forward. And the riders? They continued their lives, but the night had changed them in ways that could not be undone. They spoke less of it, shared fewer stories, but every glance, every unspoken nod carried the memory of the storm and the fragile life they had fought to save. Moments like these remind us one act of courage can create ripples that touch countless lives. Hit subscribe to see how the story unfolds next, as the impact reaches further than anyone imagined, and the bonds formed that night continue to grow. Weeks had passed since the storm, yet its echoes were still alive. The neighborhood, once quiet and indifferent, buzzed with stories of the night the unexpected heroes arrived. People spoke in hushed tones, eyes wide with disbelief and admiration, realizing that courage sometimes came from the most surprising places. The grandmother had changed. She walked taller now, a subtle glow in her movements, a quiet confidence in her smile. Neighbors who had once ignored her knocked on her door with help, invitations, and warm meals. The world that had seemed cold and indifferent now felt like it could be tender if only people dared to show up. For Marcus and his riders, life returned to its usual chaos, but they carried a quiet pride in what they had done. They didn't seek recognition, never had, but the memory of her gratitude, her relief, her fragile hope stayed with them. It had carved a permanent place in their hearts, reminding them that the toughest people can also have the kindest souls. And it wasn't just personal transformation. The night had shifted the community's perception of the riders. Fear and skepticism turned to respect, awe, and sometimes gratitude. People realized that heroism didn't always fit the mold society expected. Sometimes it came on a roaring engine, in leather jackets, and with scars earned from life's battles. The storm had passed, but its lessons endured. Courage, compassion, the power of showing up when it matters most. And in every quiet act of kindness after that night, whether a neighbor checking in, a stranger offering help,
or a rider quietly looking out for someone, the spirit of that night lived on. Months later, the memory of that night was still vivid, etched into minds, hearts, and the very fabric of the community. Snow had long melted, leaving streets clear and bright, but the warmth of that night lingered like a quiet fire. The grandmother sat by her window, sipping tea, watching children play in the sunlit street. She smiled not because life had been easy, but because she knew how fragile hope could be, and how powerful it was when someone chose to fight for it. Marcus and his riders continued their paths, roads stretching endlessly before them. But they carried something no engine roar could replace, the knowledge that their actions mattered. That night, they had saved more than a life. They had restored faith in humanity for one woman and for a community that had nearly forgotten what it meant to care. Letters, small gifts, and gestures of gratitude began to appear at the grandmother's door. Notes from neighbors, from people inspired by the story, from children who had heard the tale of the night heroes appeared out of the storm. She read each one slowly, letting the words sink in. Courage matters. Kindness matters. Heroes can be anyone. And the riders? They never sought praise. But somewhere deep inside, they knew the truth. Heroism wasn't about fame, medals, or recognition.
It was about choosing to act when no one else would. And in a world that often forgets, that choice can echo for years, inspiring change, shaping hearts, and reminding everyone that humanity is never lost. It only waits for someone brave enough to show it. The storm had passed, but its legacy endured. Not in headlines, not in pictures, but in lives forever touched, hearts forever changed, and a small, ordinary house that would always stand as proof. Even in the coldest, darkest nights, unexpected heroes can arrive, and they can change everything. If this story has moved you, make sure to subscribe. Remember, courage and kindness are contagious, and the next story could be just as unforgettable. Because sometimes, the world needs heroes in places you least expect. And maybe, even in you.